somewhere between the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and the rise of suburban lawn culture, the United States government decided that the real threat wasn't just nuclear war. It was the terrifying possibility that someone, somewhere, might be able to control your thoughts. Welcome to the story of MKUltra, where paranoia met science. Ethics took a long vacation, and the phrase, "don't drink the punch," became less of a joke and more of a survival tip. If you enjoy history that's unsettling, absurd, and occasionally dipped in government-issued LSD, subscribe for more of these slow, darkly funny narrations. Now, let's get right into it. The year was 1945. The war was over, the Nazis were defeated, and the world was supposed to be celebrating peace. Instead, it was busy building fallout shelters and stockpiling canned beans. The atomic bomb had changed everything. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement, a glowing radioactive punctuation mark that said, "We can end civilization before lunch." And while the United States had dropped the first bombs, the Soviet Union was already working on their own. By 1949, they had it. Cue the Cold War, a decades-long staring contest with nukes. But the fear wasn't just about mushroom clouds. It was about ideology. Communism wasn't just a political system. It was a creeping, invisible force that could infiltrate your schools, your unions, your movie studios, and possibly your breakfast cereal. The Red Scare wasn't just a headline. It was a national pastime. People were blacklisted, interrogated, and occasionally accused of treason for owning too many red sweaters. Senator Joseph McCarthy turned paranoia into performance art, waving around lists of alleged communists like a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat full of subpoenas. And while the public was busy ducking and covering under school desks that wouldn't protect them from a strong breeze, let alone a nuclear blast, the government was quietly panicking about something else: the mine. What if the Soviets weren't just building bombs? What if they were building brain bombs? Rumors swirled that the communists had developed techniques to brainwash prisoners, erase memories, and turn loyal soldiers into ideological sock puppets. Whether it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that it could be true. And in Cold War logic, could be was enough to justify just about anything. So while the suburbs expanded and Elvis shook his hips on national television, deep inside the corridors of power, men in suits were asking questions like, can we erase a man's identity and replace it with a new one? And what happens if we give someone LSD and lock them in a room with a strobe light and a tape recorder? These weren't science fiction plots. These were budgeted line items. And to answer those questions, the United States needed an agency. One that could operate in the shadows, answer to no one, and experiment with the human mind like it was a chemistry set. An agency born not out of peace, but out of fear. Not out of ethics, but out of urgency. The Central Intelligence Agency was officially born in 1947, swaddled in red tape and baptized in Cold War paranoia. It emerged from the ashes of the OS, America's World War II spy club, which had spent the war sneaking behind enemy lines, blowing up bridges, and writing psychological profiles of Hitler that basically said, "This guy's not doing great." When the war ended, the OSS was disbanded, because apparently someone thought, well, we'll never need spies again. That lasted about 5 minutes. By the time the Soviets started planting flags across Eastern Europe, like they were playing Risk on expert mode, the US realized it needed a permanent spy agency. Thus, the CIA was created under the National Security Act of 1947, with a mandate so vague it might as well have read, "Do secret stuff. Try not to get caught." The early CIA was a strange cocktail of Ivy League intellectuals, ex-military operatives, and men who looked like they'd stepped out of a Noir film and into a trench coat. Their job: collect intelligence, conduct covert operations, and occasionally overthrow a government or two, strictly in the name of democracy, of course. They were given a blank check, a license to meddle, and a moral compass that spun like a roulette wheel. Their headquarters was set up in Langley, Virginia, a place so secretive that even the squirrels were probably on the payroll. Inside, analysts pored over intercepted cables, field agents practiced dead drops and disguises, and somewhere in a basement, a man named Carl was probably trying to weaponize pigeons. The CIA didn't just gather information, they created it. They ran propaganda campaigns, funded foreign newspapers, and once tried to slip Fidel Castro an exploding cigar. Spoiler. It didn't work, but it did make for a great punchline. In the 1950s, the CIA was everywhere and nowhere. They were in Iran, toppling a democratically elected government. They were in Guatemala, doing the same thing. They were in Berlin, digging tunnels under Soviet territory to tap phone lines like Cold War moles with a budget. If there was a crisis, a coup, or a suspiciously well-funded student protest, odds were good the CIA had at least RSVP'd. But for all their cloak and dagger theatrics, the agency had one obsession that eclipsed all others: the human mind. Not just understanding it, controlling it. They wanted to know if you could erase a memory, implant a new one, or turn a loyal citizen into a walking, talking, state-sponsored sleeper agent. And they weren't alone in that fear. Because while the CIA was busy experimenting with truth serums and hypnosis, rumors began to swirl from behind the Iron Curtain. It started with whispers, murmurs in diplomatic cables, fragments in intercepted communications, and the occasional wide-eyed defector who claimed the Soviets weren't just building bombs. They were building obedience. The kind that didn't require chains or bullets. The kind that could make a man betray his country with a smile and a salute. And in the paranoid echo chamber of Cold War intelligence, that was all it took to send the CIA into a full-blown existential spiral. The Soviets, according to these reports, were developing psychological techniques that could override free will. Not just influence it, override it. There were stories of chemical cocktails that made prisoners confess to crimes they didn't commit, of hypnotic conditioning that turned loyal citizens into ideological marionettes, and of re-education, programs that could scrub a mind clean and install a new belief system, like a software update from hell. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that it might be. And in the Cold War, might was enough to justify anything. Then came the Chinese. Their methods were said to be more subtle, more methodical, and somehow even more terrifying. They didn't rely on flashy drugs or electric shocks. They used repetition, isolation, ideological lectures delivered with the enthusiasm of a tax auditor and the relentlessness of a dripping faucet. It wasn't about breaking bones. It was about breaking beliefs. They called it thought reform. The West called it brainwashing, and the CIA called it a 5-alarm fire. The idea that a person could be mentally reprogrammed, turned into a loyal servant of the enemy without even realizing it, wasn't just unsettling. It was existentially terrifying. It meant that loyalty, patriotism, even identity itself could be hacked. And if the Soviets or Chinese had figured out how to do it, then America was already behind in a war. It didn't understand. The press didn't help. Headlines screamed about red mind control and communist brainwashing machines. Hollywood jumped in with films that featured blank-eyed soldiers, sinister scientists, and enough dramatic lighting to make every interrogation look like a seance. The public, already jittery from duck and cover drills and backyard fallout shelters, now had to worry that their neighbor might be a sleeper agent, activated by a trigger word, and a jazz record played backwards. Inside the CIA, the response was swift and unhinged. If the enemy had mind control, then the US needed it too, preferably better, faster, and with a catchy code name. They began pouring money into research on hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and a little-known Swiss chemical called LSD that would soon become the agency's favorite party trick. But before MK Ultra officially took the stage, there were warm-up acts. Projects with names like Bluebird and Artichoke, where the ethics were optional and the science was mostly guesswork. And then came the real kicker. The moment that turned suspicion into full-blown panic. It was the early 1950s, and American soldiers were returning home from the Korean War with more than just frostbite and a deep hatred of kimchi. Some of them came back with confessions. Not the "I stole a Jeep and named it Susan" kind, but the "I now believe in the glorious revolution of the People's Republic" kind. And that, for the US government, was like finding out your golden retriever had joined a wolf pack and started howling in Mandarin. These weren't just any soldiers. They were prisoners of war who had been captured by Chinese and North Korean forces. And while in captivity, some of them had made public statements denouncing the United States, admitting to war crimes, and praising communism like it was the next big thing in breakfast cereal. When they were finally released and brought home, the Pentagon expected tearful reunions and patriotic speeches. Instead, they got awkward silences, confused stares, and the occasional "Actually, Chairman Mao had some good points." Cue the national freak out. The media dubbed it brainwashing, a term borrowed from Chinese propaganda and promptly inflated into a full-blown cultural panic. Suddenly, everyone was worried that the communists had discovered a way to scrub your brain clean and install a new operating system, one that ran on Marxist slogans and loyalty to the motherland. It wasn't just a fear of losing soldiers. It was a fear of losing selves. What if your son went off to war and came back a stranger who quoted Lenin and refused to eat apple pie? The government didn't take this lightly. Congressional hearings were held. Military psychologists were summoned. And somewhere deep in the bowels of the CIA, a man in a grey suit probably slammed his coffee down and shouted, "We need to brainwash harder." The idea that the enemy could reach into a man's mind and rearrange the furniture was too terrifying to ignore. And so, the US intelligence community decided it needed to fight fire with fire, or more accurately, fight imaginary communist mind control with very real American mind control. Because if the Reds could turn a soldier into a puppet, then by golly, the CIA was going to build a better puppet, with more strings, better posture, and possibly a built-in radio. Thus began the era of psychological warfare, covert experimentation, and a government-funded descent into the weirdest science fair in history. Before MK Ultra became the infamous headliner, there were warm-up acts. Projects with names that sounded like rejected salad dressings, but were actually blueprints for mental manipulation. First came Project Bluebird, launched in 1950, which sounds like it should involve bird watching and picnic baskets, but instead focused on how to break a human mind like a cheap toy. The CIA wanted to know if they could make someone forget everything they knew, remember things that never happened, or spill secrets under the influence of drugs, hypnosis, or a stern talking to. They tested barbiturates, amphetamines, and sodium pentothal, aka truth serum, on anyone they could get their hands on, including prisoners, mental patients, and occasionally their own agents, because nothing says team building like surprise amnesia. Bluebird's goals were ambitious: control behavior, extract information, and create agents who could be programmed like wind-up toys. But as with most government projects, it quickly spiraled into something even stranger. By 1951, Bluebird was rebranded as Project Artichoke, because apparently someone in the CIA thought, you know what's more terrifying than a bird? A vegetable with layers. Artichoke expanded the scope to include hypnosis, forced addiction, withdrawal, and electroshock therapy. If it sounded like something a mad scientist would try in a basement, Artichoke probably funded it. They wanted to know, could you hypnotize someone into committing an assassination? Could you erase their memory afterward? Could you create a human time bomb with a trigger word and a blank stare? The answer was usually no, but that didn't stop them from trying. They even explored using biological agents like dengue fever as a way to incapacitate targets, because nothing says covert op like giving someone a tropical disease and hoping they don't notice. The experiments were often conducted without consent, oversight, or even a clear plan. Subjects were dosed, shocked, isolated, and interrogated in the name of national security. Ethics were optional. Results were inconsistent. But the ambition, off the charts. The CIA wasn't just trying to understand the human mind. They were trying to own it. And then, in 1953, the curtain rose on the main act. The project that would make all the others look like warm-up stretches before a psychological marathon. Officially launched in 1953 under Alan Dulles. Alan Dulles wasn't just the CIA director. He was the kind of man who looked at a list of ethical boundaries and thought, let's see how many of these we can cross before lunch. Under his leadership, the CIA didn't just dip its toes into the murky waters of psychological experimentation. It cannonballed in, wearing a lab coat and holding a syringe full of questionable ambition. Dulles believed the United States was in a life or death struggle with communism, and if that meant turning the human mind into a government-funded science project, so be it. So, on April 13, 1953, Dulles signed off on a program that would become infamous, MK-Ultra. It was the CIA's attempt to master mind control, to find the key to manipulating thoughts, memories, and behavior like a puppeteer with a PhD. The goal wasn't just to understand the mind. It was to own it. They wanted to create truth serums, erase memories, implant false ones, and maybe, just maybe, build a real-life Manchurian candidate who could be triggered with a code word and a firm handshake. The program was buried under layers of secrecy, compartmentalized so thoroughly that even people working on it didn't always know what they were doing, or why. It was spread across universities, hospitals, prisons, and military bases, often without the knowledge or consent of the people being experimented on, because nothing says freedom like being dosed with LSD by your own government while trying to get a degree in psychology. And who better to lead this descent into the psychological abyss than a man with a background in biochemistry, a fondness for folk dancing, and a rare sommeil that read like a Bond villain's fever dream. Headed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist nicknamed the Black Sorcerer, inside the CIA, Gottlieb was not your average government scientist. He didn't wear a cape or cackle maniacally, but he did have a goat farm, a deep love for Eastern philosophy, and a habit of slipping LSD into people's drinks like it was sugar at a dinner party. He was the kind of man who could synthesize a mind-altering compound in the morning and meditate in the afternoon. A walking contradiction, part mystic, part mad scientist, and entirely too enthusiastic about testing the limits of human consciousness. Inside the CIA, Gottlieb was given the keys to the kingdom, or at least to the chemical cabinet. He was handed control of MK-Ultra and told, more or less, go nuts. And he did, Under his leadership, the program expanded into a sprawling, decentralized network of experiments that spanned universities, hospitals, prisons, and safe houses. Some of the participants were volunteers, many were not. In fact, many didn't even know they were participants until the walls started melting and the furniture began offering them life advice. Gottlieb's approach was equal parts scientific curiosity and ethical blindfold. He believed that to understand the mind, you had to break it first. And so he did, over and over again. He dosed unwitting subjects with LSD, sometimes for days at a time. He funded experiments involving hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy. He greenlit projects with names like Operation Midnight Climax, where sex workers on the CIA payroll lured men into bug departments and dosed them with hallucinogens while agents watched from behind two-way mirrors, presumably taking notes and wondering if this counted as overtime. He wasn't just interested in drugs. He explored everything from magnetic fields to sleep deprivation to subliminal messaging. If it sounded even remotely like it could mess with someone's head, Gottlieb wanted to try it. He was the CIA's very own alchemist, except instead of turning lead into gold, he was trying to turn people into programmable assets with a few drops of acid and a well-timed suggestion. And the most surreal part, he genuinely believed he was helping. Gottlieb saw himself as a patriot, a defender of democracy, and a pioneer in the uncharted territory of the human psyche. He wasn't trying to hurt people. He was trying to save the country. It just so happened that his methods involved a lot of psychological trauma and the occasional existential crisis. Goal: create truth serums, brainwashing, and mind control methods. That was the mission statement, though no one ever stitched it onto a throw pillow. MKUltra wasn't just a science project gone rogue. It was a full-blown psychological arms race. The CIA wanted to crack the human mind like a safe, and they weren't interested in subtlety. They wanted a truth serum that could make a Soviet spy spill his secrets faster than a drunk at a wedding. They wanted to erase memories, implant new ones, and maybe even create a human Etch-a-Sketch, shake it up, wipe it clean, draw something new. And they were willing to try everything. LSD was the star of the show, but it was just the opening act. They tested mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and combinations of drugs that would make a rave look like a vitamin convention. They explored hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and even psychic driving, basically playing the same message on a loop until the subject either cracked or started humming along. One experiment involved giving someone LSD for 77 days straight. That's not science. That's a psychedelic hostage situation. They weren't just trying to get people to talk. They were trying to rebuild them. Could you erase a personality and install a new one? Could you create a sleeper agent who didn't know they were a sleeper agent until someone said the magic word? Could you make someone assassinate a target and then forget they ever did it? These weren't plot lines from spy novels. These were actual research goals, written in memos and funded with taxpayer dollars. And the subjects? Well, let's just say informed consent was not a priority. Prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, and even unwitting civilians were dosed, prodded, and observed like lab rats in a Kafka story. Some volunteered. Most didn't. Some were told they were part of a study. Others were just trying to get help for depression, and ended up hallucinating their way through a government-funded nightmare. One guy thought he was signing up for a sleep study, and woke up convinced he was a glass of orange juice. The results were mixed. Some people became paranoid wrecks. Others had psychotic breaks. A few just got really into jazz. But the CIA kept going, convinced that the next breakthrough was just one more unethical experiment away. And all of it, every dose, every file, every two-way mirror, was paid for with money that didn't officially exist. Budget hidden in CIA black funds, almost no accountability. MKUltra wasn't just a secret. It was a financial ghost. The kind of project that didn't show up on spreadsheets, didn't get questioned in budget hearings, and didn't come with receipts. It was tucked away in the CIA's black budget, a shadowy pool of money that made regular government accounting look like a lemonade stand ledger. This wasn't just off the books, it was off the planet. If you asked where the money went, you'd get a shrug, a redacted memo, and possibly a polite reminder that you were now on a watch list. The black budget was the CIA's financial playground. It was a slush fund for the strange, the speculative, and the downright surreal. Need a few million to test LSD on unsuspecting civilians? No problem. Want to build a fake brothel in San Francisco and watch people trip out behind two-way mirrors? Here's a blank check. Thinking about hiring a magician to help with interrogation techniques? Sure, just don't forget to file it under behavioral modification research. The beauty of the black budget was that it didn't need to make sense. It just needed to be secret. Congress technically had oversight, in the same way a blindfolded man technically has a view. A handful of senators and representatives were briefed in classified sessions. So vague, they might as well have been reading tea leaves. The rest of Congress, they were too busy arguing about school lunches and highway funding to notice that millions of dollars were being funneled into a psychological funhouse, run by a man who thought LSD was the key to national security. The money flowed through front organizations, fake foundations, and shell universities. Grants were handed out to researchers who didn't know who was really funding them. Some thought they were studying memory. Others thought they were helping veterans. A few probably just wanted tenure. Meanwhile, the CIA sat in the background, collecting data, tweaking protocols, and occasionally asking questions like, what happens if we give this guy acid, and then make him listen to polka music for 48 hours straight? There was no accountability, no audits, no ethics boards. Just a rotating cast of scientists, spooks, and administrators who operated under the assumption that the ends justified the means. Even if the means involved psychological torture and the occasional existential meltdown. If a subject broke down, they were labeled non-compliant. If a researcher raised concerns, they were reassigned. If something went horribly wrong, it was buried deeper than a Cold War missile silo, and the results mixed at best. Some experiments produced interesting data. Others produced lawsuits. A few produced nothing but confusion and a lingering sense of dread. But the money kept coming, because in the world of black budgets, success wasn't measured in outcomes. It was measured in secrecy. As long as no one knew what was happening, it was working. And for years, no one did. The public never knew, until much later. For years, MKUltra was the CIA's worst-kept non-secret, except it was actually kept very well. Like, buried under a mountain of redacted paperwork and denied existence well. While the agency was busy turning unsuspecting citizens into psychedelic guinea pigs, the rest of America was blissfully unaware, sipping milkshakes and watching I Love Lucy, completely oblivious to the fact that somewhere, someone's dad was being dosed with LSD in a government-funded brothel while a man in a suit took notes behind a mirror and probably ate a sandwich. There were no press releases, no budget breakdowns, no, hey, by the way, We're experimenting with mind control. Memos slipped into the Sunday paper. MK Ultra operated in the shadows, under layers of fake names, shell organizations, and enough bureaucratic camouflage to make a chameleon blush. Even within the CIA, most people didn't know what was going on. It was like Fight Club. If Fight Club had a lab coat and a fondness for electroshock therapy. And the victims, they had no idea. One day they were checking into a hospital for anxiety, and the next they were hallucinating that the wallpaper was whispering state secrets. Some were prisoners, told they were part of a rehabilitation program. Others were students, lured in with promises of extra credit and a little vitamin study. A few were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong bar at the wrong time, sipping a drink that came with a complimentary existential crisis. Even the people running the experiments weren't always sure what they were doing. There were no standardized protocols, no peer reviews, and definitely no ethics committees. It was science by chaos, with a dash of Cold War panic and a sprinkle of, let's see what happens if we do this. Some researchers genuinely believed they were helping national security. Others were just excited to have a government-funded excuse to mess with people's heads. And a few probably just liked wearing lab coats and feeling important. The secrecy was so intense that when things went wrong, and oh, did they go wrong, there was no accountability. People had breakdowns. Some died. Others were left with permanent psychological scars, and no idea why they suddenly couldn't look at a lava lamp without crying. But the files were locked away, the names were blacked out, and the official response was a shrug and a, "What LSD?" It wasn't until the 1970s, decades after the experiments began, that the truth started to leak out. A few journalists got curious. A few whistleblowers got brave. And then came the Church Committee. A Senate investigation that peeled back the curtain and revealed a horror show of government overreach, scientific recklessness, and enough acid to make Woodstock look like a tea party. The public was stunned. The CIA was embarrassed. And Sidney Gottlieb, the man behind it all, quietly retired to his goat farm, probably wondering why everyone was suddenly so uptight about a little mind control. And speaking of Gottlieb loved LSD, thought it could unlock or erase minds. Gottlieb loved LSD, thought it could unlock or erase minds. Not in the, let's go to a music festival and find ourselves kind of way. And what if we could delete a personality like a corrupted file and upload a new one with better loyalty settings? Kind of way. To him, LSD wasn't just a drug. It was a key. A shimmering, unpredictable, kaleidoscopic key that might open the door to total psychological control, or possibly just a room full of melting furniture and a guy screaming at a lampshade. Sidney Gottlieb was the CIA's unofficial minister of psychedelic mayhem. He believed that LSD could be the holy grail of mind control, a substance so powerful it could dissolve a person's identity, beliefs, and memories, leaving behind a blank slate ready for reprogramming. He wasn't interested in peace, love, and understanding. He was interested in whether you could turn a Soviet spy into a loyal American by making him trip so hard he forgot what country he was from. He ordered the CIA to buy the world's entire supply of LSD. That's not hyperbole. He literally arranged for the agency to purchase every drop of acid available from Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland, like a paranoid wizard hoarding potions. The CIA paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to corner the market on a drug that, at the time, was mostly known to a handful of chemists and one very confused bicycle rider named Albert Hoffman. Gottlieb brought it to America, handed it out like candy at a haunted science fair, and waited to see what would happen. And what happened was chaos. Beautiful, terrifying, bureaucratically sanctioned chaos. Gottlieb didn't just test LSD in labs. He sent it out into the world like a psychedelic carrier pigeon. He gave it to researchers, doctors, and psychologists, some of whom knew what they were doing, and some of whom thought they were just studying behavioral responses to vitamin supplements. He funded experiments at universities, hospitals, and prisons. He created fake foundations to funnel money into studies with names like Project 42, which sounds like a Marvel villain's side hustle, but was actually just another excuse. The student would happen if you gave a college student a heroic dose of acid and asked him to solve math problem. He believed that LSD could do anything. Make people tell the truth. Make them forget the truth. Make them believe a new truth that involved secret codes, invisible enemies, and possibly a talking toaster. He thought it could be used to interrogate spies, brainwash prisoners, and maybe even create a real-life Jason Bourne, minus the abs and with more drooling. But the thing about LSD is, it's not exactly predictable. Some people had spiritual awakenings. Others had full-blown psychotic breaks. One guy thought he was a glass of orange juice and refused to lie down for fear of spilling. Another spent 6 hours trying to have a conversation with a chair. And yet, Gottlieb kept going, convinced that somewhere in the chaos was a pattern, a formula, a breakthrough. He was like a chef who kept burning the soup, but insisted the next batch would be perfect if he just added more paprika and a dash of electroshock. He even tested it on himself, repeatedly, because nothing says scientific rigor like the head of a covert mind control program, tripping in his office, while trying to write a memo about national security. Gottlieb would dose himself, lie back, and try to map the contours of consciousness, like a cartographer on mushrooms. He believed that if he could understand how LSD unraveled the mind, he could learn how to knit it back together in a new shape, one more useful to the CIA. And if that meant a few casualties along the way, well, in Gottlieb's view, that was the price of progress. A few broken eggs for a very scrambled omelette, given to unsuspecting CIA employees, prisoners, mental patients, even random civilians. That's not the setup to a bad joke. It's the actual operating procedure of MKUltra. The CIA, in its infinite wisdom and complete lack of chill, decided that the best way to test the effects of LSD and other mind-altering substances was to just give them to people, without telling them, without asking, without even a, hey, this might make you think your hands are made of bees. Just a casual, here's your coffee, Dave. Also, reality is about to melt. Let's start with the CIA employees. You'd think working for the world's most secretive intelligence agency would come with some kind of hazard pay for surprise hallucinations. But nope. Agents were dosed without warning, sometimes during meetings, sometimes at parties, and once, famously, during a retreat where one poor soul ended up diving out of a hotel window. The official report said, accidental fall. The unofficial report said, LSD paranoia for 13th floor oops. Then there were the prisoners, captive audiences, literally. The CIA figured, hey, they're already locked up. Why not see what happens if we give them a cocktail of psychedelics and ask them about their childhood trauma? Some inmates were told they were part of a rehabilitation program. Others weren't told anything at all. They just woke up one day wondering why the walls were breathing and the warden had turned into a jazz saxophone. Mental patients were another favorite. Already vulnerable, already institutionalized, and, most importantly, unlikely to be believed if they started ranting about government experiments. Perfect test subjects. According to the CIA's ethics handbook, which was apparently written in crayon and then set on fire, some patients were given massive doses of LSD, then subjected to electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and looped audio messages like, "You are not yourself," played for hours, because nothing says healing like psychological demolition. And then, because why stop there? They moved on to civilians, random people, folks just trying to enjoy a drink at a bar or check into a hospital or participate in a university study for a few extra bucks. In one infamous operation, codenamed Midnight Climax, yes, really, the CIA set up fake brothels in San Francisco and New York. They hired sex workers to lure men into rooms that were wired with microphones and two-way mirrors. Once inside, the men were dosed with LSD and observed by agents who sat behind the glass, sipping martinis and taking notes like it was the weirdest episode of Mad Men ever filmed. No one was safe. Not the students, not the soldiers, not the guy who just wanted to volunteer for a sleep study and ended up having a conversation with his own reflection for 6 hours. The CIA's approach was less scientific method and more chaotic improv with a syringe. They didn't know what they were looking for. They just knew they wanted to find it before the Soviets did. And if that meant turning half the population into accidental psychonauts, so be it. And the best part, most of the time, the subjects didn't even know they'd been part of an experiment. They just thought they'd had a really weird day, or a psychotic break, or that the coffee at the office had gotten way too strong. Years later, some of them would find out the truth, usually through declassified documents or Senate hearings, and realize that their mental breakdown had been brought to them by the fine folks at Langley. Frank Olson, a CIA scientist dosed without consent, became paranoid, died under mysterious circumstances. Frank Olson was not your average government scientist. He wasn't building rockets or inventing better paperclips. He was a bacteriologist working on biological warfare at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and a key figure in the CIA's murky world of chemical experimentation. He was also, unfortunately, the kind of guy who asked too many questions, and in the world of MK Ultra, that was a dangerous hobby. In November 1953, Olson attended a CIA retreat at a cabin in rural Maryland. It was supposed to be a casual gathering of minds. Some light conversation, a little whiskey, and unbeknownst to him, a surprise dose of LSD slipped into his drink by none other than Sidney Gottlieb himself. Because nothing says team bonding like secretly drugging your coworkers and watching them unravel like a bad sweater. Olson didn't take it well, while others laughed off the trip or stared at the wallpaper for a few hours. Olson spiraled. He became anxious, paranoid, and convinced he had made a terrible mistake. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't concentrate. He told his wife he was thinking of quitting. He told his colleagues he was having doubts. And in the CIA, having doubts is code for might talk. So they sent him to New York for psychiatric evaluation. He checked into the Statler Hotel with a CIA escort, ostensibly for rest and treatment. 9 days after being dosed, Olson went out the window of his 10th floor room at 2 a.m., wearing only his underwear. The official story, suicide. The unofficial story, well, let's just say the window was closed before he went through it, and the guy sharing the room, another CIA agent, claimed he was asleep on the toilet when it happened. The Olson family didn't learn the truth until 1975, when the Rockefeller Commission quietly admitted that a government scientist had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge and died as a result. That scientist was Frank Olson. The family got a personal apology from President Gerald Ford and a $750,000 settlement, which is the government's way of saying, "Ah, bad." But suspicions lingered. In 1994, Olson's body was exhumed for a second autopsy, which found injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. No charges were filed, but the questions never went away. Frank Olson's death became one of the darkest chapters in the MK Ultra saga. A chilling reminder that in the pursuit of mind control, the CIA wasn't just willing to bend the rules, they were willing to throw them out the window. Literally. Hypnosis experiments, hypnosis combined with drugs to induce amnesia or control behavior. If LSD was the CIA's favorite party trick, hypnosis was its awkward cousin, who showed up uninvited, but somehow ended up staying for dinner. MK Ultra researchers were fascinated by the idea that you could lull someone into a trance, whisper a few sinister suggestions, and then send them off to commit espionage, or at least forget where they parked. It was the Cold War equivalent of JD mind tricks, except with more paperwork and fewer robes. The theory was simple: combine hypnosis with drugs, and you might just unlock the cheat codes to the human brain. The practice, less elegant. Subjects were hypnotized, drugged, and then asked to do things like forget their names, recall buried memories, or believe they were chickens with top secret clearance. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they just drooled and asked for pudding. One experiment involved hypnotizing a woman, handing her a pistol, and suggesting she shoot someone. She pulled the trigger. Thankfully, it was unloaded, and then snapped out of it with no memory of what she'd done. The researchers were thrilled. The woman was probably less so. Another test tried to implant false memories, like convincing someone they had committed a crime or attended a meeting that never happened. It was like gaslighting, but with a government grant. The CIA wasn't just interested in whether hypnosis could make people do things. They wanted to know if it could make them forget things. Enter post-hypnotic amnesia, the idea that you could erase a memory with a simple suggestion, like waving a magic wand and saying, "You never saw that memo." They tested this by hypnotizing subjects, feeding them information, and then instructing them to forget it. Later, they'd try to retrieve the memory with a trigger word like pineapple or freedom. Results varied. Some subjects remembered, others just got hungry. And of course, they didn't stop at hypnosis alone. They combined it with LSD, barbiturates, amphetamines. Basically anything that could make your brain feel like it was being rebooted by a drunk technician. The idea was that drugs would lower resistance, and hypnosis would sneak in the back door. It was psychological burglary, and the CIA was very interested in what they could steal. But as with most things MK Ultra touched, the line between science and sadistic improv was blurry at best. Subjects were often unaware they were being hypnotized, let alone drugged. Consent was a luxury. Ethics were a suggestion, and the results, inconclusive, inconsistent, and occasionally terrifying. But that didn't stop them from trying again, and again, and again. Which brings us to one of the most infamous chapters. In this psychedelic fever dream, the tests on sex workers and Johns in San Francisco safe houses are, yes, Operation Midnight Climax, because apparently the CIA had a sense of humor and zero shame when naming covert operations. This wasn't just a side project. This was the CIA's idea of a bachelor party meets psychological warfare. The premise: rent out a few apartments in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood, decorate them like a 1950s bachelor pad designed by someone who had only ever seen women in pulp novels, and then hire sex workers to lure unsuspecting men into these dens of espionage and awkward lighting. Once inside, the Johns were offered a drink, a smile, and, unbeknownst to them, a generous splash of LSD in their cocktail, because nothing says, "Welcome to the CIA's hospitality suite," like a hallucinogenic surprise. The sex workers, who were on the CIA payroll separately, and probably had the weirdest job descriptions in federal employment history, were instructed to keep the men entertained while the drugs kicked in. Meanwhile, behind a two-way mirror, CIA agents sat in a hidden room, watching the whole thing unfold like it was the world's most unethical reality show. And let's talk about those rooms. They weren't just bugged. They were theatrically bugged. The walls were covered in erotic art. The furniture was plush and suspiciously stain-resistant, and the lighting was dim enough to hide both shame and surveillance equipment. It was like a noir film set designed by someone who had read too much Freud and not enough O'Shea guidelines. The agents behind the glass weren't exactly stone-faced professionals either. They were often sipping martinis, cracking jokes, and taking notes like they were reviewing a dinner theater performance. Subject appears confused. Subject is now talking to the lamp. Subject is now attempting to seduce the lamp. Subject is now crying because the lamp rejected him. It was part science, part voyeurism, and all funded by your tax dollars. The idea, if you can call it that, was to observe how LSD affected behavior in a natural setting. Because obviously, nothing is more natural than being drugged without your knowledge in a CIA run brothel while a stranger in a trench coat watches you hallucinate your way through a failed romantic encounter with a coat rack. The agents wanted to see if the drug could lower inhibitions, extract secrets, or make someone more susceptible to suggestion. What they mostly got was a lot of confused men, a few existential crises, and probably some very awkward phone calls the next morning. And the sex workers, they were instructed to report back on what the men said, how they behaved, and whether they revealed anything useful, like state secrets, criminal activity, or their favorite color. Some of the women later said they were never told the full extent of what was going on, just that they were helping with national security, which, to be fair, is a pretty solid excuse for just about anything in the 1950s. The operation ran for years. No one stopped it, no one questioned it, and no one apparently thought to ask, "Hey, is this legal?" Because in the world of MK Ultra, legality was more of a suggestion than a rule. The whole thing was so absurd, so surreal, that if you pitched it as a movie script, you'd be laughed out of the room for being too unrealistic. And yet, it happened. It really, truly happened. Agents watching from behind two-way mirrors, drinking martinis, taking notes. It sounds like a scene from a Cold War noir film, directed by someone on mescaline. But it was real. In the CIA's San Francisco safe houses, decorated like a cross between a bachelor pad and a fever dream, agents would sit behind mirrored glass, sipping cocktails and jotting down observations like, "Subject now believes he is a time-traveling walrus." Subject attempting to seduce the wallpaper. These weren't trained psychologists. These were intelligence officers with clipboards and a government mandate to watch drugged strangers unravel in real time. The setup was absurdly theatrical. The rooms were wired for sound, the lighting was dim and moody, and the walls were adorned with risque art that looked like it had been stolen from a French cabaret. The sex workers, who were on the CIA payroll, would lure men into these dens of espionage with the promise of a good time and a stiff drink. Emphasis on the stiff, because that drink was often laced with LSD. The agents behind the glass weren't just observing. They were enjoying themselves. They'd sip their martinis, crack jokes, and occasionally place bets on how long it would take before the subject started talking to the furniture. This wasn't science. This was psychological vaudeville with a federal budget. The goal, allegedly, was to see if LSD could lower inhibitions enough to extract secrets or manipulate behavior. What they mostly got was a lot of confused men, a few existential crises, and some very awkward mornings after. But the CIA kept at it, convinced that somewhere in the haze of hallucinations and bad decisions was the key to unlocking the human mind. And when the drugs didn't do the trick, they turned to something a little more electric, using high doses of electroshock therapy while patients were drugged. Because nothing says cutting edge science like zapping someone's brain while they're already tripping on a government-sponsored acid vacation. When LSD, hypnosis, and whispered affirmations failed to unlock the secrets of the human mind, the CIA decided it was time to bring out the big guns. Electroconvulsive therapy, or as it was known in the MK Ultra playbook, Tuesday. And now, electroshock therapy wasn't new. It had been used in psychiatric medicine since the 1930s, mostly to treat severe depression. But the CIA, never content with using a tool as intended, decided to crank the voltage, mix in some drugs, and see what happened when you turned the human brain into a short, circuiting Christmas tree. The result: a lot of twitching, some screaming, and the occasional subject who forgot their own name, but could recite the Gettysburg Address backward. The idea was simple. Scramble the brain just enough to make it forget what it knew, then rebuild it with new information. Like formatting a hard drive with a cattle prod. Patients were often sedated with barbiturates or benzodiazepines, then jolted with electricity, while under the influence of LSD, mescaline, or whatever chemical cocktail the lab had on tap that day. It was like trying to reboot a computer by throwing it into a bathtub and hoping it came out fluent in Russian. One of the most infamous practitioners of this method is Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish psychiatrist working in Montreal who took MK Ultra funding and ran with it like a kid who just found the keys to the candy store. Cameron believed he could depattern the human mind, wipe it clean of all memories, behaviors, and personality traits, and then reprogram it with new ones. His patients, many of whom checked in for mild anxiety or postpartum depression, were subjected to weeks of high-voltage electroshock, drug-induced comas, and looped audio messages like, "You are a good wife," or "You will not be afraid of the vacuum cleaner." Some patients received electroshock therapy 2 to 3 times a day at voltages far beyond standard medical use. Others were kept in chemically induced sleep for weeks, waking only to be shocked or fed. It was like a spa retreat designed by Frankenstein. The results were predictably horrifying memory loss, cognitive impairment, emotional detachment, and in some cases, complete erasure of identity. One woman reportedly forgot how to feed herself. Another forgot her children. A few forgot how to speak entirely. But hey, at least they weren't afraid of vacuum cleaners anymore. And the kicker: most of them had no idea they were part of a CIA experiment. They thought they were getting help. They thought they were being treated. Instead, they were being rewired like faulty appliances by men in lab coats who thought ethics were just a speed bump on the road to national security. But the CIA wasn't done, because if frying the brain didn't work, maybe starving it would. Subjects kept in isolation tanks for days. Because when you've already tried drugs, hypnosis, and electroshock, the next logical step is to stick someone in a dark, soundless tank of water and see what happens. Welcome to the sensory deprivation phase of MK Ultra, where the CIA decided that the best way to understand the human mind was to remove everything the mind could latch onto. No light, no sound, no time, no pants, probably. The idea was borrowed from legitimate psychological research, but the CIA, in true MK Ultra fashion, took it to the extreme. Subjects were placed in isolation tanks, essentially oversized bathtubs filled with body temperature water, sealed in pitch black rooms, and left to float like confused ravioli in a sensory vacuum. The tanks were designed to eliminate all external stimuli. No clocks, no windows, no noise. Just you, your thoughts, and the creeping realization that you might be a government-funded science project. Some people lasted hours, others lasted days. A few emerged convinced they had spoken to God, or at least to a very persuasive ceiling tile. The goal was to see what happened when the brain had nothing to process. No input, no feedback, no distractions. Would it unravel? Would it reset? Would it start inventing its own reality, complete with imaginary friends and a soundtrack? Spoiler, yes. Yes, it would. Subjects began hallucinating. Some saw lights. Others heard voices. A few had full-blown visions of alternate realities, childhood memories, or, in one case, a conversation with a sentient banana. The brain, it turns out, hates being bored. And when left alone in the dark long enough, it starts throwing a party no one asked for. The CIA took notes. Lots of notes. They wanted to know if this kind of isolation could be used to break down resistance, induce confessions, or make someone forget who they were and start fresh, like a psychological factory reset. And that's exactly where they were headed, attempting to wipe personalities and rebuild them. This was the CIA's psychological equivalent of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Except instead of a computer, it was a human being, and instead of a reboot button, it was a cocktail of LSD, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and a looped recording of "You Are a Good Citizen," played for 16 hours a day. Welcome to the most deranged self-help program ever funded by the US government. The idea was simple in theory and horrifying in practice. Erase a person's existing identity, memories, beliefs, behaviors, the whole mental hard drive, and then install a new one. Like formatting a brain and uploading a fresh operating system. The CIA called it depatterning. We might call it psychological demolition with a side of war crimes. One of the most infamous practitioners of this method was Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish psychiatrist working at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. Cameron wasn't just dabbling in fringe science. He was diving headfirst into the deep end with bricks in his pockets. Funded by MK Ultra through a front organization, Cameron believed he could cure mental illness by wiping the mind clean and rebuilding it from scratch. His patients, many of whom checked in for mild issues like anxiety or postpartum depression, were about to take a one-way trip through the psychological meat grinder. Cameron's process began with massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, far beyond what was considered safe or sane. Patients received shocks 2 to 3 times a day, at voltages that could make Frankenstein flinch. Then came the drug-induced comas, sometimes lasting weeks. During these chemically frozen states, patients were subjected to psychic driving, a technique that involved playing looped audio messages over and over and over again. Messages like, "You are a good mother," or "You will not be afraid of people," or presumably, "You will not sue us later." The goal was to break down the patient's existing personality until they were essentially a blank slate. Then, through repetition and suggestion, Cameron hoped to build a new personality from the ground up. It was like trying to renovate a house by bulldozing it and yelling at the rubble until it turned into a condo. The results were catastrophic. Patients emerged from treatment with severe memory loss, cognitive impairment, and emotional detachment. Some forgot how to speak. Others forgot their families. One woman reportedly forgot how to go to the bathroom. Another forgot her own name. And these weren't isolated cases. This was the intended outcome. The CIA wanted to know if this kind of mental reset could be used to reprogram spies, erase inconvenient memories, or create agents who could be triggered with a code word and a handshake. And the worst part. Most of the patients had no idea they were part of a CIA experiment. They thought they were getting help. They thought they were being treated. Instead, they were being used as test subjects in a psychological Frankenstein lab, where the goal wasn't healing, it was control. Cameron's work was so extreme that even the CIA eventually backed away. Like a party guest realizing they've walked into the wrong house, and someone's chanting in Latin. But the idea of personality erasure stuck. MKUltra continued to explore ways to break down and rebuild the human mind, convinced that somewhere in the chaos was a formula for obedience. And if electroshock and psychic driving didn't do the trick, maybe the answer lay in chemistry. Testing different chemicals for control, truth extraction, and psychological torture. If MKUltra had a greatest hits album, this would be the title track. The CIA, in its relentless quest to turn the human brain into a programmable etch-a-sketch, decided that the answer might lie in chemistry. Not just any chemistry, weird chemistry. The kind that makes you see sounds, taste colors, and confess to crimes you didn't commit just to make the walls stop breathing. They tried everything. LSD was the headliner, of course, but it was just the opening act in a chemical circus that included mescaline, psilocybin, MDMA, scopolamine, sodium amytal, barbiturates, amphetamines, and combinations of all of the above. If it could be swallowed, injected, snorted, or slipped into a cocktail. The CIA wanted to know what it did to your sense of self, your loyalty to the state, and your ability to remember your own name. One favorite combo was the truth sandwich, a barbiturate to knock you down, followed by a jolt of amphetamines to yank you back up, and then a few questions like, have you ever met a Soviet agent? Or, do you believe in free will? The idea was to disorient the subject just enough to bypass their defenses and get them to spill secrets, or at least admit to stealing office supplies. They also experimented with substances that caused confusion, anxiety, or total disassociation. One chemical made people forget where they were. Another made them forget who they were. One poor soul reportedly spent an entire session convinced he was a bowl of oatmeal. The CIA took notes. Subject appears emotionally unstable. Subject also requests brown sugar. Then there were the more exotic compounds. One drug was designed to induce temporary paralysis while leaving the mind alert, perfect for interrogations, or for terrifying someone into thinking they'd been turned into a sentient statue. Another caused uncontrollable diarrhea, which, while not exactly mind control, was apparently considered a valid interrogation technique. Tell us what you know, or we'll give you the bad chili again. They even dabbled in aerosolized chemicals, hoping to create a gas that could be sprayed over enemy troops, to make them too confused to fight. One idea involved a madness mist that would cause hallucinations and panic. Another was a truth fog that would make people blurt out classified information like a toddler with a secret. None of these worked as intended, but they did make for some very colorful lab reports. And let's not forget the aphrodisiacs. Yes, the CIA tried to develop a chemical that would make people irresistibly attracted to each other, or to their interrogators. The logic was unclear, but the enthusiasm was real. One memo suggested using it to create confusion and compromise in enemy ranks. Another just had a doodle of a heart with LSD-fueled scrawled in the margins. The testing was relentless. If a chemical made someone sleepy, they tested it. If it made someone paranoid, they tested it twice. If it made someone think they were being chased by invisible squirrels, they probably threw a party. The goal wasn't just to find a truth serum. It was to find anything that could be used to manipulate, control, or dismantle the human psyche, like a Lego set with missing instructions. And who were the lucky recipients of these chemical experiments, administered to prisoners, mental patients, and unwitting military personnel? If MK Ultra had a customer base, it would have been the most unwilling, unknowing, and deeply unfortunate loyalty program in history. The CIA, in its infinite wisdom and complete disregard for informed consent, decided that the best way to test its ever-growing arsenal of mind-bending chemicals was to try them out on people who couldn't say no, or didn't even know they were being asked. Let's start with the prisoners. Captive audiences, literally. The CIA figured, hey, they're already behind bars. Why not see what happens if we give them a little something extra with their mashed potatoes? Inmates at federal prisons, like Atlanta and Lexington, were dosed with LSD, mescaline, and other delightful substances under the guise of rehabilitation research. Some were told they were part of a study. Others were just told to drink the Kool-Aid, except this time, it wasn't metaphorical. One prisoner later described the experience as like being trapped in a kaleidoscope with a hangover. Another thought he'd turned into a lizard and tried to climb the walls. The guards were not amused. Then there were the mental patients, already vulnerable, already institutionalized, and, most importantly, unlikely to be believed if they started ranting about CIA mind control. Perfect test subjects. According to the agency's ethics handbook, which was apparently written in invisible ink, patients were given high doses of LSD, subjected to electroshock therapy, and sometimes kept in drug-induced comas for days. One woman checked in for postpartum depression and checked out with no memory of her husband, her children, or how to use a spoon. Another patient was told she was receiving vitamin therapy. She later described the experience as a Technicolor nightmare with jazz music and screaming wallpaper. And then, because why stop there? They moved on to the military. Soldiers were dosed without warning during training exercises, briefings, and even while on duty. One group of Marines was given LSD and then sent into the woods to complete a mock combat mission. They ended up building a campfire, singing folk songs, and trying to negotiate peace with a tree. Another soldier was given a dose before a parachute jump. He forgot how to pull the cord and had to be rescued mid-air. The CIA called it data collection. The Army called it a paperwork nightmare. Some of the most infamous tests were conducted at Edgewood Arsenal, where military volunteers, many of them young, poor, and unaware, were exposed to everything from nerve agents to hallucinogens to incapacitating agents that made them drool, babble, or believe they were being chased by invisible squirrels. The volunteers were told they were helping with defensive research. What they weren't told was that the defense was mostly against their own sanity. And let's not forget the civilians. Random people walking into hospitals, universities, or even bars. who ended up as unwitting participants in the CIA's chemical circus. Some were students lured in with promises of extra credit. Others were just trying to get help for anxiety and ended up hallucinating that their therapist was a talking pineapple. One man went to a clinic for insomnia and left, convinced he was a time traveler from the year 3000. The CIA took notes. Subject appears disoriented. Subject also believes he invented jazz. The common thread. None of them knew what was happening. None of them consented. And none of them had any idea that their breakdowns, hallucinations, or sudden fear of doorknobs were part of a government experiment. It wasn't just unethical. It was surreal. A Kafkaesque nightmare with a budget and a clipboard. Many were mentally ill or prisoners, often unable to consent or resist. And that's what made them perfect test subjects in the eyes of MKUltra's architects. Vulnerable, voiceless, and conveniently tucked away from public view. If you were already locked up, institutionalized, or labeled unstable, who was going to believe you if you started ranting about government agents, slipping you acid and whispering code words into your ears? It was the perfect crime, equal parts science fiction and bureaucratic nightmare. In prisons, inmates were told they were part of rehabilitation programs. In reality, they were being used to test everything from truth serums to chemical restraints. Some were promised reduced sentences in exchange for participation. Others weren't even given that courtesy. They were just handed a pill, a drink, or a syringe and told to sit back and relax, while their minds were quietly dismantled and catalogued. In psychiatric hospitals, the situation was even more grotesque. Patients already struggling with mental illness were subjected to high doses of hallucinogens, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation. Some were kept in drug-induced comas for days or weeks. Others were hypnotized, interrogated, and recorded like lab rats in a Kafka novel. They weren't just being treated. They were being tampered with. And when they cried out, no one listened. Because who listens to the mad? And then there were the military personnel, young, idealistic, and completely unaware that their own government was using them as guinea pigs. Some were told they were participating in stress tests or survival training. Others were simply dosed without warning and left to navigate a psychedelic minefield while their commanding officers took notes. One soldier reportedly spent an entire drill convinced he was a tree. Another tried to interrogate his own boots. The CIA called it data collection. The soldiers called it Tuesday. The common thread: none of them could truly say no. They were either coerced, messled, or simply not told what was happening. Consent was a formality, not a requirement. And resistance? Well, good luck resisting when you're strapped to a gurney, pumped full of drugs, and surrounded by men in lab coats who think your brain is just another puzzle to solve. And the consequences? Devastating. Families destroyed, minds broken permanently. That's not poetic exaggeration. It's the legacy MKUltra left behind, tucked between redacted memos and shattered lives. For many of the program's victims, the damage wasn't temporary or theoretical. It was permanent, irreversible. The kind of damage that doesn't just ruin a person. It ripples outward, warping families, friendships, and futures like a stone hurled into a still pond of trust. Imagine being a spouse watching your partner unravel. Not from illness or trauma, but from something they can't explain. Because they don't know they were drugged, shocked, or psychologically dismantled by their own government. One day they're fine. The next, they're paranoid, hallucinating, or unable to remember your name. You try to help. You try to understand. But how do you fight an invisible enemy with a security clearance. Children grew up in homes where one parent was a ghost of who they used to be. Some watched their mothers or fathers spiral into depression, addiction, or institutionalization. Others were told their parent had nervous problems, never knowing those problems were chemically induced by a clandestine experiment with a code name and a budget. Families were torn apart not by war or poverty, but by science gone rogue in the name of national security. And the worst part, there was no closure, no explanation, no apology. For decades, these families were left to pick up the pieces without even knowing what had shattered them. They were told it was mental illness, stress, bad luck. They were gaslit by omission, left to grieve people who were still alive but no longer themselves. Some victims ended up homeless, others institutionalized, a few took their own lives, and the families, they were left with questions, guilt, and the gnawing suspicion that something terrible had happened. Something no one would talk about. The trauma didn't end with the experiments. It echoed through generations, passed down like a cursed heirloom. And then there were the rare few who did find out the truth, who dug through declassified documents, connected the dots, and realized that their loved one hadn't just snapped, they'd been broken. Deliberately, systematically, in the name of science and secrecy. One of those families was the Olsons. Frank Olson's family's fight for justice. For over 2 decades, the Olson family lived in a fog of confusion, grief, and unanswered questions. Frank Olson, a government scientist with a PhD in biochemistry, had been a key figure in the US Army's biological warfare program at Fort Detrick. He was also tragically one of MKUltra's earliest casualties. In 1953, after being covertly dosed with LSD by his CIA colleagues during a retreat, Olson spiraled into paranoia and despair. Days later, he plunged to his death from a 10th floor window of the Statler Hotel in New York. The official story? Suicide. The real story? A decades-long mystery wrapped in redactions and sealed files. His wife, Alice, and their children were told little. He fell or jumped, they were told. No mention of LSD, no mention of CIA experiments, just a vague, bureaucratic shrug. For years, the family tried to move on. Alice took a teaching job but struggled with alcoholism. The children grew up, pursued careers, and tried to make sense of a father who had vanished, not just physically, but narratively. Eric Olson, Frank's eldest son, became obsessed with the truth. He earned a PhD in psychology, but his real education came from poring over declassified documents, tracking down witnesses, and confronting the ghost of his father's past. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission revealed that a government employee had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge and died as a result. That employee was Frank Olson. The family was stunned. The government offered a settlement and a formal apology from President Gerald Ford. But for Eric, it wasn't enough. He wanted the truth. He wanted accountability. He wanted to know if his father had jumped or been pushed. Eric's quest became a lifelong mission. He exhumed his father's body in 1994. The second autopsy revealed injuries inconsistent with a simple fall, suggesting foul play. He held press conferences, gave interviews, and even inspired books and documentaries. He called himself the Hamlet of the CIA, haunted by a father's ghost and driven by a need for justice in a world that preferred silence. The Olson family's story wasn't just about one man's death. It was about the ripple effects of secrecy, the collateral damage of unchecked power, and the human cost of a government experiment gone rogue. Their fight became a symbol, a reminder that behind every redacted file is a family left in the dark. And while the Olsons were one of the few families to uncover the truth, they were far from alone. Testimonies from survivors describing nightmarish hallucinations and loss of identity for those who lived through MK Ultra's chemical circus. The aftermath wasn't just a bad trip, it was a permanent detour from reality. Survivors of the program, those rare few who eventually discovered what had been done to them, described their experiences like waking nightmares, stitched into their memories with barbed wire. These weren't just bad vibes or weird dreams. These were full-blown psychological implosions, engineered by men in lab coats who thought ethics were optional and side effects were someone else's problem. One former subject, dosed without consent during a university study, recalled spending hours convinced he was dissolving into the floor. He said he could feel his thoughts leaking out of his ears. Another described being trapped in a loop where time folded in on itself. He relived the same moment over and over, each time slightly more distorted, like a VHS tape melting in the sun. When he finally came down, he couldn't remember his own name for 3 days. The CIA called it data. He called it losing my soul. Others spoke of hallucinations so vivid they left lasting trauma. One man believed he was being interrogated by aliens. Another thought he had died and was watching his own autopsy. A woman described seeing her reflection morph into a stranger's face, then into her mother's, then into a skull. She didn't look in mirrors for years. These weren't metaphors. These were the raw, unfiltered accounts of people whose minds had been hijacked in the name of national security. And the identity loss. That was the real kicker. Some survivors reported forgetting entire chunks of their lives, birthdays, relationships, even their own children. One man said he woke up after a session and didn't recognize his wife. Another forgot how to read. A few were left with permanent cognitive damage, unable to hold jobs, maintain relationships, or function in society. They weren't just traumatized, they were rewritten. And not very well, the worst part. Many of them didn't even know what had happened until decades later. They thought they were going crazy. They were told they were unstable, delusional, or just sensitive. It wasn't until the 1970s, when MK Ultra was dragged into the light by congressional hearings and declassified documents, that the truth began to surface. And even then, it was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces shredded and the rest dipped in ink. But perhaps the most chilling connection to MK Ultra's legacy wasn't found in a lab or a hospital, but in a Harvard classroom. Connection to the Unabombus, Ted Kaczynski possibly participating in Harvard mind control experiments. Connection to the Unabombus, Ted Kaczynski possibly participating in Harvard mind control experiments. Before he was the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski was a teenage math prodigy with a scholarship to Harvard and a penchant for solitude. At just 16 years old, he entered the hallowed halls of academia, where he would soon find himself not just studying calculus, but unknowingly starring in a psychological experiment that would make MK Ultra look like a team building exercise. Between 1959 and 1962, Kaczynski participated in a Harvard study led by psychologist Dr. Henry A. Murray, a former OSS operative and one of the pioneers of personality testing. The experiment, officially titled Multiform Assessments of Personality Development among Gifted College Men, was less about development and more about psychological demolition too. Here's how it worked. Students were asked to write deeply personal essays about their beliefs, values, and aspirations. Then, they were strapped to chairs in front of bright lights, hooked up to electrodes, and subjected to brutal, confrontational interrogations by law students trained to attack their ideas, mock their convictions, and generally reduce them to emotional rubble. All of it was filmed. All of it was repeated for 3 years. Kaczynski's code name in the study, lawful. The irony practically writes itself. The goal, according to Murray, was to study how individuals responded to stress and humiliation. But to many, it looked suspiciously like psychic deconstruction, a psychological hazing ritual with a Harvard letterhead. Some researchers have speculated that this experience, combined with Kaczynski's growing disillusionment with modern society, helped shape the anti-technological ideology that would later fuel his bombing campaign too. Was it officially part of MKUltra? That's still debated. But the timing, the methods, and the CIA's known interest in Harvard's psychological research make the connection more than a little suspicious. At the very least, it was a parallel experiment in the same twisted spirit: break the mind, see what's left, and call it science. And while Kaczynski would eventually retreat to a Montana cabin and declare war on industrial society, the rest of the country was about to wake up to its own uncomfortable truth. The 1970s were a time when America's trust in its government was unraveling faster than a polyester leisure suit in a bonfire. The Watergate scandal had just detonated across the headlines, revealing that the President of the United States had been running a criminal conspiracy out of the Oval Office, like it was a mob front with better stationery. The public, already jittery from Vietnam, civil rights clashes, and the general vibe of what is even happening anymore, was now fully primed to believe that the government might be up to no good behind closed doors. Enter the Church Committee, officially known as the Senate Select Committee, to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Try fitting that on a business card. Chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, the committee was formed in 1975 with a mission that sounded simple but was anything but investigate the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS to determine whether they had been behaving like responsible public servants or like a bunch of overfunded Bond villains with a grudge against the Constitution. Spoiler, it was the latter. The Church Committee was born out of a perfect storm of paranoia and accountability. In 1974, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times alleging that the CIA had been spying on American citizens, anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, journalists, for years in direct violation of its charter. This wasn't just a case of, oops, we accidentally tapped your phone. This was a full-blown domestic surveillance program that made Orwell look like an optimist. The Senate, still reeling from Watergate and eager to prove it could do oversight without falling asleep at the wheel, launched the Church Committee in early 1975. The hearings were part courtroom drama, part horror show, and part civics lesson. Over the course of 16 months, the committee interviewed more than 800 witnesses, held 250 executive sessions, and conducted 21 public hearings that were broadcast on national television. Americans tuned in expecting C-SPAN and got something closer to the X-Files Congressional Edition. What they learned was staggering. The CIA had plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, multiple times, with increasingly cartoonish methods. The FBI had run Cante y El Paro, a program designed to infiltrate and disrupt civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and even Martin Luther King Jr. The NSA had been collecting telegrams and communications from American citizens under a program called Project Shamrock, which sounds like a breakfast cereal, but was actually a massive violation of privacy. The committee also uncovered the CIA's MKUltra program, though by then, most of the juicy details had already been buried deeper than a Cold War missile silo. Still, the revelations were enough to make the public realize that the government hadn't just bent the rules. It had folded them into paper airplanes and launched them into the abyss. Senator Church himself warned that the intelligence agencies had grown so powerful and unaccountable that they could, in theory, impose total tyranny if left unchecked. He wasn't being dramatic. He was reading from the receipts. The Church Committee's work led to major reforms, including the creation of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which still exists today to provide oversight of the intelligence community. It also helped usher in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FESID of 1978, which established a secret court to oversee government surveillance requests. Because nothing says, "We trust you," like a secret court. But even as the committee was shining a light into the darkest corners of American intelligence, it became clear that some shadows were too deep to penetrate. Discovery of destroyed documents, shredded files, attempts to cover up. If MKUltra was a psychological horror story, then the cover up was its final twist. The moment when the villain doesn't just flee the scene, but burns the evidence, rewrites the script, and bribes the projectionist to say the movie never existed. By the early 1970s, the CIA could feel the heat. The Vietnam War was unraveling, Watergate was bubbling, and the American public was developing a healthy skepticism toward men in suits who said, "Trust us." Inside Langley, panic was setting in. The agency had spent 2 decades conducting experiments that ranged from the unethical to the outright surreal, and now there was a very real chance that someone might start asking questions. Questions like, why did we drug that guy in the bar? Or, why is there a file labeled Operation Midnight Climax next to the coffee machine? Enter CIA Director Richard Helms, a man who understood that plausible deniability works best when there's nothing left to deny. In 1973, just as the Watergate scandal was reaching a boil, Helms issued a quiet but devastating order: destroy all MKUltra records. Not review, not redact. Destroy, shred them, burn them, feed them to the office goldfish. Whatever it took to make sure that when the subpoenas came knocking, the filing cabinets would be as empty as the agency's conscience. And so, thousands of documents vanished. Gone were the memos detailing dosages, the reports on psychological breakdowns, the receipts for LSD shipments, and the handwritten notes that probably said things like, "Subject 12 thinks he's a toaster." Promising. It was a bureaucratic bonfire, a paper apocalypse. The CIA didn't just erase the evidence, they tried to erase the memory of the evidence. But here's the thing about government agencies: they're terrible at cleaning up after themselves. For every file that was shredded, another was misfiled, duplicated, or accidentally left in a drawer labeled miscellaneous weird stuff. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA request unearthed a cache of over 20,000 documents that had survived the purge purely by accident. They'd been stored in a financial records archive and overlooked because, apparently, even the CIA can't resist the siren song of bad filing systems. The discovery was explosive. These weren't vague summaries or sanitized reports. These were raw, unfiltered glimpses into the madness: budgets, correspondences, experiment logs, and enough bureaucratic jargon to make Kafka weep. They revealed a program far more expansive, chaotic, and ethically bankrupt than anyone had imagined. And they proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the CIA had not only conducted illegal human experimentation, but had tried to bury it under a mountain of shredded paper and plausible deniability. The cover-up extended beyond the documents. Witnesses were silenced, whistleblowers were ignored, and internal investigations were about as rigorous as a game of hide and seek with a blindfolded referee. When pressed, agency officials claimed they couldn't recall key details, weren't aware of certain activities, or had simply followed orders. It was a masterclass in institutional amnesia, delivered with the straight-faced sincerity of a magician sawing a woman in half and insisting it's all perfectly safe. Even the surviving documents were heavily redacted. Pages were blacked out until they looked like modern art. Names were removed, dates were obscured, and entire paragraphs were replaced with the bureaucratic equivalent of It was transparency with a Sharpie, accountability with an asterisk. And yet, despite the destruction, despite the denials, despite the desperate attempts to pretend it had all been a bad dream, the truth began to leak out, piece by piece, testimony by testimony, until finally, the Senate had no choice but to act. The 1977 hearings revealing horrifying details, but many facts still missing. By the time the 1977 Senate hearings rolled around, the American public had already been served a sampler platter of government misdeeds. Watergate, Poirot, and the Church Committee's revelations had primed the nation for one more helping of what fresh hell is this? But even the most jaded citizens weren't prepared for the full buffet of bizarre, unethical, and downright dystopian details that emerged when the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research convened to dig into MKUltra. The hearings, held on August 3, 1977, were prompted by the accidental discovery of over 20,000 MKUltra related documents that had survived CIA Director Richard Helms' 1973 document purge because they were misfiled in a budget archive. These weren't just dusty memos and vague outlines. They were receipts, correspondences, and experiment logs that painted a picture of a program that had gone completely off the rails. It was like finding a diary from Dr. Frankenstein, only with more LSD and fewer lightning bolts. Senators Daniel Inouye and Edward Kennedy led the charge, grilling CIA officials with the kind of polite fury that only Congress can muster. Admiral Stansfield Turner, the then Director of Central Intelligence, was called to testify. He admitted that the agency had conducted unethical and illicit activities, which his government speak for. We did some stuff that would make a Bond villain blush. The hearings revealed that MKUltra had operated across over 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons, many of which had no idea they were hosting CIA-funded experiments. Used unwitting American and Canadian citizens as test subjects, including prisoners, mental patients, and even random civilians. Conducted experiments involving LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, amphetamines, and other psychoactive substances, often without consent. Explored hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and psychic driving as tools for behavioral modification. Funded bizarre sub-projects like Operation Midnight Climax, where sex workers lured men into CIA-run brothels to be dosed and observed through two-way mirrors. One of the most chilling revelations was that many of the test subjects had no idea they were part of an experiment. They thought they were receiving therapy, participating in academic research, or just having a drink at a bar. Instead, they were being used as guinea pigs in a covert psychological arms race. And yet, for all the shocking details, the hearings were also defined by what they couldn't uncover. Thanks to Helms' document purge, most of the records were gone. The committee had to rely on the surviving documents, the testimony of a few brave whistleblowers, and the CIA's own selective memory. It was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces shredded and the rest dipped in black ink. Senator Kennedy summed it up best when he said, "The best safeguard against abuses in the future is a complete public accounting of the abuses of the past." But that complete accounting never came. Too many files were destroyed. Too many names were redacted. Too many people had already died, some under mysterious circumstances. Still, the hearings marked a turning point. For the first time, the American public saw the full scope of what had been done in the name of national security. The experiments, the cover-ups, the shattered lives. And with that realization came a chilling truth, America's realization. The government experimented on its own people. It hit like a thunderclap wrapped in redacted paper. For decades, Americans had been told that their government was the shining beacon of democracy, the land of liberty, the place where freedom rang louder than a brass band on the 4th of July. And then came the gut punch. The same government had secretly drugged, shocked, hypnotized, and psychologically dismantled its own citizens, all in the name of national security. The revelations from the Church Committee and the 1977 Senate hearings weren't just shocking. They were existential. This wasn't some rogue agent or isolated incident. This was a systematic, taxpayer-funded, multi-decade program that operated under the noses of Congress, the press, and the public. MK Ultra wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a conspiracy fact. The American people learned that prisoners, mental patients, and civilians had been used as test subjects, often without their knowledge or consent. LSD, barbiturates, amphetamines, and other drugs had been administered in experiments that would make a mad scientist blush. Electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and hypnosis were used not to heal, but to erase and reprogram. CIA-run brothels were used to observe drugged men through two-way mirrors, while agents sipped martinis and took notes like it was a twisted cocktail party. And perhaps most chilling of all, the goal wasn't just to understand the mind, it was to control it. The public reaction was a mix of disbelief, outrage, and a creeping sense of betrayal. Editorials were scathing. Protesters took to the streets. Late-night comedians tried to joke about it, but even the punchlines felt hollow. How do you laugh about a government that turned its own citizens into lab rats? People began to question everything. If the CIA could do this, what else had they done? What else were they still doing? Trust in institutions plummeted. The phrase, government experiment, stopped sounding like science fiction and started sounding like Tuesday. And yet, for all the fury, for all the headlines, for all the hearings and hand-wringing, public anger but limited accountability, when the truth about MK Ultra finally oozed into the public consciousness like a bad acid flashback, America was not amused. The collective reaction was a mix of disbelief, outrage, and the kind of existential dread usually reserved for realizing your dentist is also your landlord. People were furious. Rightfully so. Their government. The good guys, the ones with the flags and the eagles and the stirring orchestral music, had been secretly drugging, shocking, hypnotizing, and psychologically dismantling its own citizens like a toddler with a Mr. Potato Head and a grudge. And what did the government do in response to this righteous fury? Well, not much. Sure, there were hearings. There were apologies. There were solemn nods and furrowed brows and statements like, "Mistakes were made," which is political code for, "We did something terrible, but would prefer not to talk about it." President Gerald Ford even invited the Olsen family to the White House for a formal apology, and a $750,000 settlement, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, "Sorry, we threw your dad out a window. Here's a check and a handshake." But beyond that, crickets. No one went to jail. No one lost their pension. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who ran MK Ultra like a psychedelic Willy Wonka, retired quietly to his goat farm in Virginia, where he spent his days meditating and presumably not thinking about the time he tried to erase people's personalities with LSD and electroshock. Richard Helms, the CIA director who ordered the destruction of the MK Ultra files, got a slap on the wrist and a comfy ambassadorship. It was like watching the end of a heist movie where the criminals walk away with the loot and a wink. Congress passed some reforms, created oversight committees, and promised to do better next time. But let's be honest, oversight in the intelligence community is like putting a "please don't sign" on a cookie jar and expecting a toddler not to dive in face first. The CIA kept doing CIA things, just with slightly more plausible deniability and fewer receipts. Meanwhile, the victims of MK Ultra were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered minds. Some filed lawsuits. Most were dismissed. Why? Because the government argued that the statute of limitations had expired. That's right. If you were unknowingly drugged and psychologically dismantled by your own government, you had to figure it out and file paperwork within a few years, or else it was just water under the acid-soaked bridge. And the public? Oh, the public was mad. Editorials were written. Documentaries were made. Conspiracy theories blossomed like mushrooms in a damp basement. But the outrage had nowhere to go. There was no villain to arrest, no trial to watch, no satisfying conclusion. Just a lot of shredded documents, redacted names, and the gnawing realization that the people in charge had treated the Constitution like a suggestion and the human mind like a chemistry set. It was the kind of scandal that should have changed everything. But instead, it became a cautionary tale with no moral, a horror story with no ending, a government oopsie that got filed under. Let's not talk about that again. And so, in the absence of justice, the story of MK Ultra took on a new life, one that would echo through basements, message boards, and late-night radio shows for decades to come. MK Ultra became a touchstone in conspiracy communities. Once the details of MK Ultra began trickling into public consciousness, through Senate hearings, declassified documents, and the occasional "wet, what?" moment on late-night TV, it didn't just fade into the annals of history. Oh no. It exploded into the collective imagination like a tab of government. Grade LSD dropped into a punch bowl at a UFO convention. For conspiracy theorists, MK Ultra was the Holy Grail, the Rosetta Stone, and the "I told you so" of the century. It was proof, documented, admitted, and horrifying, that the government had not only lied to the public, but had actively experimented on its own citizens in ways that made Orwell look like a children's author. And if they did that, what else were they hiding? Cue the rabbit hole. Suddenly, MK Ultra was everywhere. It became the connective tissue in a sprawling web of theories that linked everything from alien abductions to fluoride in the water to subliminal messages in breakfast cereal. If someone forgot where they put their keys, there was a non-zero chance someone nearby would whisper, "MK Ultra." It was the ultimate boogeyman, faceless, shadowy, and backed by receipts. Conspiracy forums lit up like Christmas trees. People combed through declassified documents, looking for hidden meanings, code names, and clues. So Project 68 became shorthand for "the government is up to something shady." Operation Midnight Climax became a punchline and a warning. And Sidney Gottlieb, He was elevated to near mythical status, a cross between Dr. Frankenstein Rasputin and your weird uncle who insists the moon landing was filmed in a basement. The beauty of MK Ultra, from a conspiracy standpoint, was that it was real. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't hearsay. It was a documented, admitted program that involved drugging people, erasing memories, and trying to control minds. That kind of thing doesn't just validate conspiracy theories, it supercharges them. It's like finding out Bigfoot has a LinkedIn profile. And so, MK Ultra became the go-to reference point for every unexplained phenomenon involving memory loss, erratic behavior, or sudden changes in personality. Celebrities who had public meltdowns. MK Ultra. Mass shooters with no clear motive. MK Ultra. That one time you walked into a room and forgot why you were there. Probably MK Ultra. It didn't help that the program's name sounded like a rejected Marvel villain. MK Ultra had a sleek, ominous ring to it, like something you'd find etched into a secret lab door or whispered by a dying informant in a spy thriller. It was cinematic, it was mysterious, it was perfect, and Hollywood noticed. Which brings us to the next chapter in MK Ultra's strange afterlife: mind control claims in pop culture. Paranoia in the 70s and 80s. The 70s and 80s. A time when hair was big, pants were flared, and everyone was absolutely convinced that the government was trying to beam thoughts into their heads, using microwaves, disco, and possibly the Bee Gees. The revelations about MK Ultra didn't just rattle the public, they electrified the pop culture imagination. Suddenly, mind control wasn't just a sci-fi trope, it was a documented possibility. And America, being America, did what it does best: turned its collective paranoia into entertainment. Let's start with the news media, which treated MK Ultra like a gateway drug to every possible conspiracy. Talk shows featured guests who claimed to have been brainwashed by the CIA, their neighbors, or their toaster. Geraldo Rivera practically built a second career out of whispering satanic ritual abuse into a fog machine. And if you turned on the TV late at night, you were bound to find a grainy documentary with ominous music and a narrator who sounded like he'd seen things. Terrible things. Involving hypnosis, LSD, and possibly a haunted Etche sketch. Then came the satanic panic, a full-blown cultural fever dream that swept through the 80s like a moral tornado in shoulder pads. Fueled by books like Michelle Remembers and a national obsession with Dungeons and Dragons, which, according to some, was less a game and more a demonic summoning ritual with dice. The public became convinced that satanic cults were everywhere. Daycare centers, infiltrated, rock bands, possessed, your neighbor's garden gnome, suspiciously pointy. And of course, music wasn't safe either. Backmasking became the new boogeyman. Parents were told that if you played your kids' records backward, you'd hear secret messages like, "Worship the Dark Lord," or "Eat more fiber." Congressional hearings were held. Tipper Gore made a list. Ozzy Osbourne was blamed for everything from teen rebellion to crop failure. Meanwhile, actual musicians were like, "We just wanted to write a song about dragons, man." Even toys and cartoons weren't spared. He-Man, occult propaganda, the Smurfs, blue communists, Rainbow Bright, too bright, clearly hiding something. Saturday morning TV became a battleground for the soul of America's youth, and every pixel was suspect. Somewhere, a group of concerned parents probably held a prayer circle over a speak and spell. And let's not forget the CIA's cameo in pop culture. Suddenly, every thriller, spy novel, and late-night radio show featured shadowy government agents with syringes, full of truth serum, and a fondness for saying things like, He doesn't know he's a sleeper agent yet. MK Ultra became shorthand for the government is doing weird stuff again, and audiences couldn't get enough. The paranoia was so pervasive that even home appliances weren't safe. People started wondering if their microwaves were listening, if their TVs were watching, if their VCRs were secretly judging their taste in movies. They were, especially if you rented Howard the Duck more than once. And through it all, Hollywood was taking notes. Inspired movies. The Men Who Stare at Goats, Jacob's Ladder, The Bourne Identity. MK Ultra didn't just leave a trail of broken minds and shredded documents. It left a cultural crater so deep, Hollywood couldn't resist diving in headfirst with a camera crew and a fog machine. The program's blend of secrecy, science fiction, and bureaucratic madness was cinematic catnip, and so, the silver screen lit up with stories that were part thriller, part satire, and poet. This is based on what? The Men Who Stare at Goats 2009 is perhaps the most on the nose MK Ultra inspired film ever made. Based on John Ronson's book of the same name, it follows a journalist who uncovers a secret US military unit that believes it can walk through walls, become invisible, and kill goats with the power of thought. Yes, goats. The film is a satirical fever dream starring George Clooney, Ewan McGregor, and Jeff Bridges. And it's loosely based on real-life experiments conducted by the US Army's 1st Earth Battalion, a group that genuinely explored psychic warfare, spoon bending, and other Jedi-adjacent nonsense. It's like MK Ultra met Monty Python and decided to start a militia. Jacob's Ladder, 1990 takes a darker, more psychological route. It's a surreal horror film about a Vietnam veteran haunted by terrifying hallucinations and fragmented memories. The twist. He may have been subjected to secret government experiments involving psychoactive drugs. The film doesn't name MK Ultra directly, but the fingerprints are all over it. Chemical manipulation, memory distortion, and the creeping dread that your reality might be a government construct. It's like if MK Ultra had a nightmare and then wrote a screenplay. The Bourne Identity 2002, and its sequels gave us Jason Bourne, the amnesic super assassin with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass and a past so classified, even he doesn't know it. While the films are based on Robert Ludlum's novels, the concept of a government program that erases identities and creates programmable killers is pure MK Ultra fantasy fuel. Bourne is what MK Ultra wanted to create, an obedient, lethal, memory-wiped agent who could be activated with a code word and a bad haircut. Instead, they mostly got confused college students and lawsuits. These films, and many others, didn't just entertain. They reflected a growing cultural unease, with the idea that the government might be hiding more than just Area 51 and the real recipe for Coca-Cola. MK Ultra became a cinematic shorthand for the government is messing with your brain, and audiences couldn't get enough. But here's the kicker. While these movies played with the idea of secret labs and shadowy experiments, the truth was even stranger. Actual black sites and safe houses were real. And no, we're not talking about some Hollywood backlot or a Bond villain's lair with sharks and lasers. These were actual, physical locations, often tucked away in plain sight, where the CIA conducted some of its most secretive and ethically questionable experiments. Think less science lab and more Airbnb for paranoia. Let's start with the infamous safe houses. These weren't your average suburban hideouts with a welcome mat and a bowl of mints. These were fully furnished apartments, often in cities like San Francisco and New York, rented under fake names and operated by CIA front organizations. Inside, They were rigged with two-way mirrors, hidden microphones, and enough surveillance equipment to make a reality TV producer weep with envy. The most notorious of these was part of Operation Midnight. Climax, yes, that was the actual name, because apparently the CIA had a flair for the dramatic and zero HR oversight. In these safe houses, sex workers were hired by the CIA to lure unsuspecting men inside. Once there, the men were dosed with LSD without their knowledge, and their behavior was observed by agents sipping martinis behind mirrored glass like. It was the weirdest episode of Big Brother ever filmed. But it wasn't just about watching people trip out in velvet, curtained dens of espionage. These sites were also used for interrogation experiments, hypnosis trials, and chemical testing. Some were disguised as clinics, others as university research labs. A few were even embedded in military bases, where soldiers were told they were participating in stress tests or survival training, only to find themselves hallucinating that their commanding officer was a talking cactus. And then there were the black sites, locations so secretive that even other parts of the government didn't know they existed. These weren't just safe houses, they were the books facilities where the CIA could operate without oversight, accountability, or, apparently, a working moral compass. Some were overseas, others were buried in the bureaucratic shadows of domestic institutions. All were designed to be invisible, both physically and legally. One such site was Fort Detrick, Maryland, home to the U.S. Army's biological warfare program and a key hub for MK-Ultra research. Another was the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where Dr. Ewan Cameron conducted his infamous psychic driving experiments, funded by the CIA through a front organization. Patients there were subjected to drug-induced comas, repetitive audio loops, and massive electroshock therapy, all under the guise of psychiatric treatment. These locations weren't just creepy. They were operational theaters for a psychological war that most Americans didn't even know was happening. And because they were off the books, they operated with zero accountability, no ethics boards, no oversight committees. Just a handful of men with security clearances and a dream of turning the human mind into a programmable machine. And here's the kicker. Many of these sites were never officially acknowledged. Some were uncovered through declassified documents. Others were revealed by whistleblowers. But a large number remain shrouded in mystery, their addresses lost to time and redacted memos. For all we know, one of them could now be a yoga studio, or a frozen yogurt shop, or your cousin's apartment. Which brings us to the question that still haunts historians, journalists, and anyone who's ever accidentally read a declassified memo at 2 a.m. lasting questions. Did the experiments end? Or did they evolve into new programs? The million-dollar question. Right after, where did my tax dollars go? And why does my toaster keep blinking Morse code at me? When MK-Ultra was officially shut down in the early 1970s, the CIA gave the public its best impression of a magician, ending a show a puff of smoke, a bow, and a promise that the rabbit was totally fine and definitely not traumatized by the experience. But here's the thing. When a government program gets shut down, it doesn't always mean it's gone. Sometimes it just means it got a new name, a new budget line, and a slightly less embarrassing acronym. MK-Ultra may have been buried, but its spirit lives on, like a ghost in a lab coat, still whispering. What if we gave the subject 2 tabs of acid and a kazoo? Let's break it down. The bureaucratic shuffle MK-Ultra had over 150 subprojects, many of which were farmed out to universities, hospitals, and private contractors when the program was terminated. those institutions didn't just pack up their beakers and go home. Some of the research continued under different umbrellas, like MK Search, MK Often, and the ever mysterious Artichoke, which sounds less like a covert operation and more like a CIA-sponsored salad bar. Rebranding, the government's favorite trick. You know how companies rebrand after a scandal. We're not All Corp anymore. We're Eccleston Solutions! The CIA does the same thing. MK Ultra may have ended, but behavioral research didn't. It just got folded into new programs with names like non-lethal weapons or enhanced interrogation techniques, because nothing says weak watered our lesson like water believing someone while asking it believing free will. The rise of surveillance and psychological ops. As technology advanced, so did the tools of control. Why bother with LSD when you can track someone's every move through their phone, predict their behavior with algorithms, and influence their decisions with targeted ads? It's like MK Ultra got a software update and now runs quietly in the background of your social media feed. Suggested for you: mild paranoia and a sudden distrust of your microwave. Modern echoes in military and intelligence, research programs like DARPA's research into brain-computer interfaces, the military's interest in cognitive warfare, and even the development of calmative agents. Read, drugs that make people chill out involuntarily, all raise eyebrows. Are they direct descendants of MK Ultra? Not officially. But the family resemblance is uncanny. Like seeing your uncle's nose on a stranger and thinking, wait a minute, the paper trail. That wasn't thanks to Helm's legendary document Bonfire. We'll never know the full extent of what MK Ultra spawned. But every so often, a new file gets declassified, a whistleblower speaks up, or a FOIA request turns up something that makes you go, huh. That's weirdly specific and deeply unsettling. Like the time the Department of Defense explored using pheromones as a battlefield weapon. Because nothing says tactical advantage, like confusing your enemy with the scent of desperation and Axe body spray. So, did the experiments end? Officially, yes. Unofficially, let's just say the lab coats may have changed, but the curiosity and the funding never really went away. Which brings us to the next big question. What did they actually learn? LSD was not a truth serum. After years of dosing unsuspecting civilians, prisoners, mental patients, and even their own agents, the CIA came to a stunning scientific conclusion. LSD is not a truth serum. It does not make people more honest. It does not make them more cooperative. It does not unlock the secrets of the universe, unless the secret is that the wallpaper is breathing, and your hands are made of jazz. Let's rewind. When MK Ultra began, the CIA was obsessed with the idea of a chemical shortcut to truth. They wanted a potion that could make spies spill secrets, make prisoners confess, and maybe even make foreign leaders admit they were secretly lizard people. LSD, newly discovered and wildly misunderstood, seemed like the perfect candidate. It was potent, unpredictable, and made people say weird things. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. The early tests, the CIA started by slipping LSD into drinks at parties, meetings, and team-building retreats that quickly turned into psychological horror shows. Agents were dosed without warning, and then observed to see if they'd start confessing to espionage, embezzlement, or stealing someone's lunch from the break room fridge. Instead, they mostly confessed to being terrified, confused, or convinced that their shoelaces were plotting against them. One agent, after being dosed, became so paranoid he jumped out of a hotel window. Another spent hours trying to interrogate a coat rack. A third simply curled into a ball and whispered, "The furniture knows." None of them revealed state secrets. All of them needed therapy. The science of chaos LSD doesn't make people more truthful. It makes them more impressionable, more emotional, and more likely to believe that time is a flat circle made of spaghetti. Under the influence, subjects would say anything, sometimes profound, sometimes nonsensical, often both. One prisoner claimed he was the reincarnation of Napoleon. Another insisted he could hear colors. A third confessed to a crime that hadn't happened yet. The CIA realized that while LSD could destabilize a person, it couldn't be used to reliably extract information. It was like trying to get a straight answer from a tornado. You might get something interesting, but it probably won't be useful. And it might involve screaming. The polygraph problem. They even tried combining LSD with lie detectors, hoping the drug would make lies more obvious. Spoiler, it didn't. The polygraph needles just danced around like they were at a rave, and the subjects either giggled uncontrollably or cried, because the machine looked sad. The results were so inconsistent that even the CIA had to admit defeat. LSD was not a truth serum, it was a chaos grenade. The personality puzzle. Another theory was that LSD could help break down a person's personality, making them easier to reprogram. But instead of wiping the slate clean, it just scribbled all over it in crayon. Subjects didn't become blank slates. They became Jackson Pollocks of emotion and confusion. Some forgot who they were. Others thought they were someone else. One man believed he was a CIA agent. He wasn't. But the CIA took notes anyway. The final verdict after years of experimentation, the CIA concluded that LSD was too unpredictable, too destabilizing, and too likely to make someone try to hug a filing cabinet. It didn't produce truth. It produced weirdness. And while weirdness has its place, see Burning Man, it's not ideal for national security. So, what did they actually learn? LSD is not a truth serum. It does not make people more honest. It does not make people more obedient. It does make people think their toes are radios. It is not a reliable interrogation tool. It is definitely not a good idea to give it to someone and then ask them to jump out of a plane. And perhaps most importantly, you can't control someone's mind with acid and a clipboard. Which brings us to the CIA's next big disappointment. They failed to create mind-controlled assassins. Oh, how the CIA dreamed. They wanted Jason Bourne. They got a guy who thought he was a pancake and tried to butter himself. From the very beginning, MK Ultra had a cinematic goal: create the perfect sleeper agent. A human Swiss Army knife of espionage, deadly, obedient, and activated with a code word like pineapple or liberty. The idea was that you could take an ordinary person, erase their identity, implant a new one, and then send them off to do your dirty work without them even knowing it. It was like trying to turn a house cat into a Navy SEAL. Ambitious. Yes. Realistic. Not even close. The CIA tried everything. Hypnosis? Check. LSD? Double check. Electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, psychic driving, subliminal messaging, and probably interpretive dance at some point, because why not? They threw the entire psychological kitchen sink at their subjects, hoping to unlock the secret to turning someone into a human remote-controlled murder machine. One experiment involved hypnotizing a woman and handing her a gun, suggesting she shoot someone. She pulled the trigger. It wasn't loaded. She snapped out of it and had no memory of what she'd done. The CIA took this as a promising sign. The rest of us might call it deeply alarming. Another subject was told under hypnosis that he was a secret agent on a mission to assassinate a foreign diplomat. He got as far as the hotel lobby before forgetting what he was doing and ordering a tuna sandwich. Mission not accomplished. They even tried combining hypnosis with LSD, hoping the drugs would make the brain more pliable. Instead, they got subjects who were either too paranoid to leave the room or too fascinated by their own hands to hold a weapon. One man was so convinced he was invisible that he tried to sneak past a guard by crawling under a table while humming the Mission Impossible theme. He was not invisible. He was, however, very committed. And let's not forget the animal experiments. Yes, the CIA tried to create mind-controlled cats. They surgically implanted electrodes into feline skulls, hoping to steer them toward surveillance targets. The cats, being cats, immediately wandered off, ignored commands, and refused to cooperate unless bribed with tuna. One was reportedly hit by a taxi during its first field test. The program was quietly cancelled, and the CIA presumably went back to the drawing board with a note that read, "It's ungovernable." The problem wasn't just that the science was bad, it was that the idea was bad. Human beings are not blank slates. You can't just erase someone's personality and upload a new one like a software patch. The brain doesn't work that way. It's messy, emotional, and stubbornly resistant to being turned into a murder bot. Even when subjects were successfully hypnotized or drugged into a suggestible state, the results were wildly inconsistent. Some became catatonic, others became euphoric. A few just started quoting Shakespeare and asking for pudding. None of them became reliable assassins. The CIA wanted a Manchurian candidate. What they got was a Manchurian catastrophe. And so, after years of experimentation, millions of dollars, and enough LSD to fuel 1,000 music festivals, the CIA had to admit the truth. They learned how to break people, not control them. In the end, MK Ultra didn't produce mind-controlled assassins, psychic spies, or human lie detectors. What it produced, reliably, repeatedly, and with disturbing efficiency, was broken people. The CIA set out to master the human mind, to bend it like a paperclip into whatever shape suited their Cold War fantasies. What they got was a masterclass in how to dismantle a person's identity like a malfunctioning IKEA bookshelf. With missing instructions, too much force, and a lot of swearing. Let's be clear, the CIA didn't just fail to control people. They excelled at destroying them. They learned how to erase memories, not with surgical precision, but with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Subjects emerged from experiments unable to remember their names, their families, or how to tie their shoes. Some forgot how to speak. Others forgot how to feel. One woman, after weeks of electroshock and drug-induced comas, forgot she had children. Another forgot how to walk. These weren't side effects. These were outcomes. They learned how to induce psychosis, not temporarily, not therapeutically, but in a way that left people permanently altered, paranoid, dissociated, and emotionally hollow. One subject described feeling like a ghost in my own body. Another said he could no longer tell if his memories were real or implanted. A few simply stopped speaking altogether, as if language had been evicted from their minds. They learned how to create fear, not the kind that makes you jump at shadows, but the kind that makes you question whether you are the shadow. Subjects were kept in isolation tanks for days, fed hallucinogens, and bombarded with contradictory messages until they no longer trusted their own thoughts. One man was told he was a traitor. Another was told he was a hero. Both were wrong. Both were broken. They learned how to dismantle trust. Patients who sought help were betrayed by their doctors. Soldiers who volunteered for research were betrayed by their commanders. civilians who walked into clinics were betrayed by their government. The very institutions meant to protect them became the architects of their unraveling. They learned how to erase agency. Subjects weren't just manipulated, they were unmade. Their choices, their beliefs, their very sense of self was stripped away and replaced with confusion, fear, and silence. It wasn't mind control. It was mind obliteration. And perhaps most tragically, they learned how to make people doubt their own pain. Many survivors didn't even know they were part of an experiment. They thought they were going crazy. They were told they were unstable, delusional, or just sensitive. It wasn't until decades later, when documents were declassified and hearings were held, that they realized their suffering had been engineered. So no, the CIA didn't learn how to control people. They learned how to break them, efficiently, systematically, quietly, and in doing so, ethics were destroyed in the process. Not bent, not bruised, not gently nudged aside with a polite, "Pardon me." No, ethics were taken out back, blindfolded, and shoved into a sensory deprivation tank, while someone whispered, "It's for national security." What began as a Cold War scramble for psychological advantage ended as one of the most egregious violations of human rights ever sanctioned by a democratic government. And the worst part, it was all done in the name of science, the kind of science that wears a lab coat but forgot to pack a conscience. Let's be clear, MKUltra didn't just cross ethical lines. It bulldozed them, paved over the rubble, and built a secret research facility on top. Informed consent, that was optional. Transparency, laughable. Oversight? Only if you count a guy in sunglasses muttering, "Seems fine," while flipping through a redacted memo. Doctors. Actual licensed, Hippocratic oath, swearing doctors participated in these experiments. They administered drugs, electroshock, and psychological torture to patients who trusted them. Some of those patients were mentally ill. Some were prisoners. Some were just people who walked into the wrong clinic at the wrong time. None of them signed up for what they got, and many of them never recovered. The ethical violations weren't just individual, they were institutional. Universities took CIA money through front organizations, often without knowing or wanting to know where it came from. Hospitals became testing grounds. Prisons became laboratories, and the people inside, they became data points. Disposable, replaceable, forgettable. The CIA justified it all with the same tired refrain. We had to do it to beat the Soviets. As if the moral high ground could be maintained while standing on a pile of broken minds. As if democracy could be defended by abandoning the very principles that define it. And when it all came to light, when the hearings were held, the documents declassified, the apologies issued, what was the consequence? A few wrist slaps, a few early retirements, a few settlements paid out with taxpayer money. The people who designed MKUltra didn't go to prison. They went to brunch. The legacy of MKUltra isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a warning label for unchecked power. It's a reminder that when secrecy becomes policy and fear becomes justification, ethics are the first casualty. And once they're gone, it's a long, dark road back. So yes, ethics weren't just compromised. They were obliterated. And the echoes of that destruction still reverberate today, in every debate about surveillance, consent, and the limits of government power.
Disclaimer time!
We've done our best to stick to the historical record, pulling from declassified documents, Senate hearings, and the occasional CIA memo that somehow survived the office shredder. But hey, history is messy. Some details are still classified, some were destroyed, and some were probably scribbled on a napkin and lost in a safe house couch. So if we got a date wrong, or accidentally accused a filing cabinet of espionage, please forgive us. We're only human.
You made it to the end of the narration!
That means you're either a history buff, a conspiracy connoisseur, or someone who accidentally clicked on this and thought, well, I'm in too deep now. Either way, subscribe, comment, and share your favorite MK Ultra fact or hallucination below. Did you enjoy the ride? Did your toaster wink at you halfway through?
Let us know!
And if you were listening to this to help you fall asleep, close your eyes, breathe deeply. Forget the CIA, forget the goats. You are not a sleeper agent. You are a sleepy agent. Drift off now. The only thing being programmed is your REM cycle. Good night, Dreamwalker.